We had an episode a few days ago about Syria and the current situation in Syria, and obviously Syria and Lebanon are very and have been very much interconnected politically and economically in very detrimental ways for Lebanon for sure. But one of the things that we talked about was on a more grand scale, was looking at how politically when Syria became was like a vassal state of Iran, and we've seen the same thing with Iraq. We've seen the same thing with this dominance, this political dominance that Hezbollah has in Lebanon. We also see with that comes a lot of failure when it comes to state functioning and corruption and militias popping up. At least in Lebanon, there's only one, but in Syria, Iraq, you see similar patterns, and so I wanted to get an idea from you also. I mean, yes, different people in Lebanon may have different subjective opinions, of course, based on their political backgrounds or what have you, but it seems also that with the last couple of years, with the protests, with this breakdown of government, you're seeing a coalescing of sorts, especially of the youth in Lebanon. I'm not going to say all, but it's becoming more apparent that there is this recognition that there is this problem, this political problem, and this entity, Hezbollah, its loyalty isn't to Lebanon, it's to Iran. And it's everything it does is for its own purposes and for Iran's purposes. So I wanted to get your opinions and thoughts on that too, especially with like the sense of what people are feeling on the street when it comes to that.
You've asked this question in such an eloquent way, and it's a great thing when a fellow podcaster is given all the terrain necessary to say the story as it is without loose ends. So I appreciate the way you framed the question, and it resonates. It resonates thoroughly. And it's quite obvious that you're in tune with what's happening, not just in Lebanon, but the region. I completely agree. This is a shared story. It has ripple effects. Last year, it wasn't just Lebanese protesting. Iraqis were protesting in full force. A violent crackdown on those protests in comparison to what happened in Lebanon. Many Iraqis killed, challenging a geopolitical quagmire. And Iran, in the last few days, but not just the last few days, regularly, in the last at least 11, 12 years, has Iranians are on the street demanding change. And I think it's just a few days ago, maybe just over the weekend, slogans coming out from Tehran saying, "No to Lebanon, no to Gaza," which means implicitly stop funding groups that are hurting Iran's economy. It may not be for the same reason that we protest here, but it lines up geopolitically. So there is a structural paradigm that is under threat by inhabitants, local inhabitants, that may not express their desires in those ways. It may not be directly anti-Iran. You won't see necessarily anti-Iranian slogans or the flag itself being brought up, but it's economic. And when it's economic, dignity is at stake. When there's starvation, people will challenge any authority. And I think that has happened. These countries are suffering to the point that even a very, very long imposed disorder through Iran's proxies, primarily Hezbollah, but others as well, is eroding. Now, I don't think it will collapse in the near future. Those investments are decades old, but the grip has weakened. And you see an appetite, even among previous allies to that structure, you see an appetite for change. This could be, for example, just a small but important example. And I'm sorry to use these quasi-Orientalist ways of describing, but I don't know any better way to do this. Hezbollah strongholds, whatever that means. Parts of Lebanon where there is a Hezbollah security infrastructure, at least. You saw protests there. Now, they may not be anti-Hezbollah in nature, but they're anti the larger picture. So Hezbollah's role does come up. Whether or not they're crushed, whether or not that's intimidated, whether or not protesters are forced home is separate. The demands haven't changed. So there is a threat, at least, to this regional disorder that Lebanon is clearly a part of, but as is Syria, as is Iraq, to a lesser degree, and perhaps a more tragic degree, Yemen as well, and Gaza. Hamas is part of this story too. And the populations have suffered too long. And I think this is why you see this erosion at a societal level having geopolitical implications. So you can't buy time. People have reached their limit.
On a technical note, I think it'd be a good time to, if you can turn on the light in your car.
Am I in the dark?
You're a little bit in the dark.
There I am.
We want to be able to see your lovely face.
I really apologize for this. Well, I mean, hopefully some electricity.
No, don't worry. Don't worry about it. We understand, and we want our listeners to really know what's.
I mean, you're on
going on. Like this is
you're on the front lines.
I'm on the front line of everything that's wrong
of this regional like disaster.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I think the the whole region is in kind of a disaster, and to have, I mean, the war with Yemen has been horrific. The war in Syria has been horrific. Egypt is a total crackdown police state. I mean, like from 2011 to now. 2011, for me, I thought it was a very hopeful moment that people were demanding their rights and saying we've had enough of these corrupt governments. We've had enough of the corruption. We've had enough of like these military states that came about through coup d'etats, and we want governments that represent us and serve our needs, where we have enough. Like even in the 90s, when Egypt was doing relatively well, the electricity and water would be shut off randomly at any time. You never know when. And the infrastructure is just like, there is no investment in infrastructure, and someone's always making money off of all of that, all of the resources, and people are making money, and at the same time the people don't have reliable power, they don't have reliable water, and it's not that the state doesn't have the money to pay for it, it's that the wrong people are taking the money. That's my impression.
I mean, you're probably so much better versed in what's been happening in Egypt than I'll ever be, and I won't even try to overstep here. I will maybe offer a step back, and
sure,
I think there's a shared problem in this entire region, which is political violence dictates everything. There's no case in this part of the world where democracy is allowed to do its job, which is bad ideas are voted out, or if they're voted in, they're tested to make sure they're bad, and then they're thrown out. Good ideas hopefully win more than bad, and enough incentive for minorities to feel secure. That to me seems reasonable. Some of these countries have facades of it. Maybe Lebanon is one example where there's this veneer of democracy, yet that veneer is equally destroyed when it comes to violence. And when I say violence, I don't mean crime in that people are criminals towards each other. I mean political violence. in that a regime or a militia can kill ideas. It's not killing, it's not civil war like scenario, it's actually
Hmm.
murder. Egypt is full of this, Iraq is full of it, Syria is full of it, Lebanon has had its fair share. And when it's not direct violence, even though this has happened on occasion, even in Tunisia, it's a tolerated situation where the state trumps the system in a way that's so unhealthy to society. So Tunisia, the last few days, it seems like a fait accompli that even Tunisia, that shining star of the
Mm.
Arab Spring, those expectations have their own limits, where political violence can and still does take charge of the story. So I think that is the sad conclusion of the Arab Spring, which is there was nothing to prevent murder and intimidation and violence from winning. This did not happen in other parts of the world nearly as much, whether it's Eastern Europe in post 1989, which had enough incentive to make do without that stuff, or even South America, Latin America, which found its way, and most parts of the world that have found their way. I mean, whether it's Southeast Asia, we're now uh, the most difficult and challenged part of the world. But I think violence is the story. If
Well,
you if you're able to if you're able to allow for the exchange of ideas without that threat, I think all these countries would be in a far better place in every single way possible.
I mean, I would say that sub-Saharan Africa is in a similar situation to the Middle East, in terms of irascible conflicts that just never end. And um, I would,
But I'll interject one last thing before I
sure,
start to interrupt. I mean, Syria, whatever you want to call that conflict, war, revolution, whatever.
yes,
The fact is, millions of Syrians are displaced,
mm,
perhaps hundreds of thousands are murdered, and half of Lebanon is potentially either Syrian refugees or Palestinian refugees. That accepted as part of the story is that you take it for what it is, that we're living this part of the world, that has permanent scarring.
yeah,
When you can't challenge your leadership peacefully, and now we have one of the most horrendous, atrocious leaders who've survived so much, still running Syria and still capable of running Syria. That says it all. It says that if you do try still, even now, to try to win the right way, overwhelming likelihood you'll get killed while you're trying.
sure.
I will say
There's
one thing
always
about sub-Saharan Africa, just really quick, is that obviously it's a giant like region, so it depends on like country by country, but as a whole, I would say that if we're talking economically, there are some cases in sub-Saharan Africa where countries are slowly inching forward and coming together, at least economically. People talk about this future that Africa has, that it seems that that part of the world has even surpassed the Middle East. Like the Middle East is so far behind and has just become in such a huge mess.
yeah. No, I mean,
So,
I don't think you're wrong there. I think there is more of a light at the end of the tunnel politically for a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But I would say, I mean, and Africa and the Middle East have so many resources, natural resources, and sources of wealth that could be utilized to serve the populations. Um, so I think the question to be asked, and it's a question that's usually answered in a very racist kind of a way, is why is it that these regions aren't prosperous like European countries that are uh, that have far less resources but are actually prosperous. I think, you know, there's usually a very racist answer to that. And would you like to comment on that?
I don't know. No, I don't know what the racist reference is, but I'll say it in a different way. The further back in time you go in this part of the world, the richer it is in everything.
Yeah.
The richer it is in sorry to use this word, but culture. It's a very cosmopolitan part of the world. It once was among the most cosmopolitan. And this is real cosmopolitanism, not the flimsy type that people talk about. It's real. You have diversity of everything, and languages are spoken. Fundamentalists live next to secularists. And Europeans come to this part of the world to work, and add to that a real healthy exchange of communities that don't always see eye to eye, but live side by side, and an intersection that you want. There's a reason for it, and it makes sense geographically and historically. So there's a mosaic that's magnificent, and it's all but gone today. And I think I know where the question's going. There are parts of this region that are very rich, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait, Qatar, or even for that matter, Iran, that have resources, have money to spend, but that's an abnormal wealth of oil and oil money that doesn't exist in other parts of the world. Clearly doesn't exist in Lebanon. All the banks that once operated here, the 90 banks that were once here, their investors are gone. The money and the talent, the education, we had the most impressive university in this part of the world. American University of Beirut ranks lower and lower every year, almost shut down last year. This is a unfortunate flight to oil producing countries. But even then, whether it's the UAE with its very strange setup in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, or whether it's Saudi Arabia, with its vicious form of theocracy, or even for that matter, Iran, which spends almost all of its money on regional war, that money is not spent the right way.
Yeah.
So we have wealth, but it chased oil. The real wealth, the real richness of this part of the world is gone. I mean, these cities don't look or feel, or even they're not the same. I mean, Alexandria in Egypt, Beirut in Lebanon. Sorry to include Turkey here, but I'll include it. Smyrna and Izmir. These places are not what they used to be, and that's a 20th century story. Except Beirut somehow, even after civil war, even after repeated invasion, Israeli invasion or Syrian invasion and occupation, up until the port blast, even with economic dysfunction, we still prided ourselves as being the last bastion, which is why many people would flock here. And I'm going to include you, Khalid. You didn't have to be here, but you chose to be here. I'm guessing you wanted to come here because there's an enchantment to visiting this city. That's gone. And that's a very sad ending to this city, because it had that. And people use this word repeatedly, resilience. That's what they were talking about. It was a resilient city, but it doesn't feel that way anymore. So I think, unfortunately, Lebanon has joined the club.
Well, to get into a little bit of history, if I may, since you brought up the history so beautifully, and I think it's important for people to know that we have a rich history, and that this is something that we should know and fall back on, to know also what our future may look like as well. In terms of resources, yes, in terms of like what we're calling like hard resources, let's say oil and gas, if we're talking about the Gulf states or Iran, what have you, sure. But if we go back in time and we look at let's say the Levant area, or Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, those areas that were not rich in natural resources, but they were rich in people. Like the people were like it's the human resources, I think, that made that area shine. In that, if you didn't have the wealth of other parts of the world, you had commerce, you had
Mm-hmm.
trade, you had uh, the exchange of, as you put it, cultures, the intermixing of cultures, and where all these different civilizations met would produce something beautiful, and it did. And so, unfortunately, with war, as we see now and we've seen in the past, people flee, and that creates a brain drain in those areas, and it's a huge loss. However, if we also look at the history of our region, it's survived a lot of war and a lot of conflict, a lot of invasions, and somehow it comes back at some point. People are able to eventually come together and make something out of what remained. And so, that might, I don't know how long that might take, if that'll be in our lifetimes or not, but we for people who think that this region is just utter devastation and chaos and destruction, and it's always been that way, they should know that that's not the case, right? And that the people have the capacity. I know that when I mean, my family's Syrian. I grew up in Syria, and I heard the same thing about Lebanon as well after the civil war. When you have a conflict like that, you have a lot of people who become expats or refugees who flee, but they have so much desire to come back. And when things settle down, a lot of them do, and they do good things. I mean, you want the right sort of environment, you want the right uh, political system to accommodate that, of course. That comes before anything else. And I think that was where, as you mentioned, there was a big mistake in the post-Civil War period in Lebanon.
I completely agree. And I think Syria is the most striking example where a population is forced into something that is so miserable, where half the population is displaced or is out of the country, where too many decent people are killed, challenging the worst form of autocracy. And when they are given that chance today to go home, they're going home to something that did the same thing. It's a very difficult decision. Can you return when things have gotten worse and the same crowd is still ruling? I think that is an ultimate red line for the decent people that fled but should come back. Because who would want to? If you're out and those people are still around, you don't want to return. This is what makes our part of the world, I think, strikingly different. I'll give you an example. Uh, Hundreds of thousands of Bosnians were forced to flee, whether it's Sarajevo or Mostar or anywhere in Bosnia. Many Croatians, many Serbians too, forced out. They may not be coming back to the version that they dreamed of. It may not be the most decent form of accountability. It may not be the most peaceful situation, but they're returning, and this is 25 years later. They're returning, whether it's in Germany or in America or Australia, to a country that they believe in and one that is getting better and better. Whether it's through EU accession, whether it's through economic prosperity, or whether it's even through the guarantee that those murderers were held to account, at least up to a point. This could be Ratko Mladic or Karadzic, paramilitary leaders responsible for genocide. Even when their posters are put up now, they're taken down. So there's an assurance that there's no impunity. This word, I think we don't even consider it in this part of the world. Take it as it is. Impunity is part of the story, which it shouldn't be. So there's no paying a price for being a criminal in this part of the world. I think if one day we have that, if these types of criminals are held to account, at least to a point, I think you would see the description that you laid out, which is, why would you want to be in California when you're from one of the most beautiful countries in the world? Why would
Very
the other
true.
Khalid want to be in, is it Los Angeles where you guys are?
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
we're
guessing. Okay, I mean, Los Angeles, fine. Traffic, yeah, it's terrible in Cairo too, but Cairo, not too long ago, would trounce Los Angeles. And
oh,
that's not the
That's
case right
true.
now.
I mean,
Yeah,
we would
pre
hands down.
1980s, like, you know what I mean, like
exactly.
the 80s and 90s trashed Cairo, and part of it was neoliberal reforms to the economy that brought in like foreign investors that basically just enriched a small amount of the population and kind of trash. There's a lot of stuff to talk, you know, in terms of like like how populations, you know,
But it's so bad, Khalid. It's so bad that your reference point is the 1980s, which are the good days, which are still pretty bad compared to the
yeah,
shining star Cairo once was.
yeah, in the
So that,
1960s, you know,
yeah.
it was
But this is something that I think it makes no sense why those that love this part of the world the most are not here. But
yeah.
if you put the word impunity in there,
Well,
meaning there's no
yeah.
accountability,
We'll
we'd
see.
want to be in a, yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, like, it's very interesting that you brought up Serbia and the Bosnian conflict, because the Serbian uh, military leaders are some of the only people that have actually been convicted in the international court ever. You know, like no one, you know, the international law doesn't like it's never, it's very hard to prosecute, and Serbians are some of the only people where they actually successfully prosecuted some of these people.
I think
And I
that
think
was
we need
like
to beef that
an
up.
example of like, let's give some sort of um, legitimacy to this court. So let's just go after the Serbians. But yeah, no, I
I
agree
mean,
with
the
what you're
international,
saying.
you know, we need to beef up the International Criminal Court, because they actually, we saw a successful prosecution of war criminals. But pretty much the only place that that's really happened is with Serbians from 25 years ago. And so it basically, you know, it takes like, you know, a quarter of a lifetime to get to a point of justice.
Yes, and it also takes a deliberate effort by players that have leverage to
Yes,
unplug hotspots from geopolitical nightmare.
yeah,
Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia,
yeah,
even
yeah,
Kosovo have nothing to worry about, at least for the time being. We deserve this type of architecture. I mean, the amount of bloodshed by Qaddafi, by Assad, or by any despot, Saddam, we deserve something much more elaborate than the ICTY of Yugoslavia. We didn't get that. There's one example only, a very small one. It's the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which indicted one person,
mhm,
one Hezbollah operative who's named. The Lebanese state will never be able to deliver that name, deliver that individual to The Hague. Add to that, in a case of what was meant to be trial in absentia, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon suspended itself and has shut down due to budgetary constraints. So even then, this one example is gone. That will definitely dampen anyone's expectation for an international investigation into the port blast, or a tribunal for the port blast, or a tribunal for Assad's crimes, or a tribunal period. So that I agree with you that yes, the ICTY perhaps didn't do enough. But the fact is, people that were in jail died, or they're in jail permanently,
mhm.
life sentences. And if they died either natural causes or they committed suicide. Milosevic died from, I think, if I remember correctly, a stroke. The Bosnian Croat leader, his name escapes me now, paramilitary leader, he killed himself on TV drink cyanide, drink
Yeah, I
something.
remember that. I remember that.
And Mladic and Karadzic will never come out of jail. Why don't we have something at least at that level? More people have died here, more countries have suffered. You need international assistance in that stuff. No international assistance in telling our part of the world. Yeah, sorry, just one thing. There's no needed recommendation on countries in this part of the world on how exactly they govern themselves, or what exactly sectarianism means to them, or for that matter, what mosaic and minority rights end up looking like. That's what everyone in this part of the world has to figure out on their own. That also includes accountability, reform, anti-corruption. We have to figure that stuff out. But ending violence at the regional level, we can't do it on our own. It's impossible.
Yeah,
Neither could the Bosnians, and neither could the Croats or the Serbs.
True. No, you're not wrong, but I would add an addendum to that, in that the Middle East has too much international assistance. And by that, I mean international interference. Too many powers are fighting out their, world chess game in the Middle East. And so the Middle East becomes the battleground. Like Syria, what region, like, what is the reason that Russia is interested in Syria? It's a part of an international chess game for Russia. Why is China like trying to get in on, like, well, we want contracts for reconstruction? It's an international game of interference, and there's too many between the US, between the EU, Russia, China, Iran, fighting out their battles with each other in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. And it's, you're destroying countries because they know if they went to like head-on war with each other, it would be devastating for both countries. So it's like, let's just destroy this country that we don't care as much about.